October 22, 2019, Beverly Hills, California. A woman who had dedicated 9 years of her life to serving one family walked into her employer's private study and discovered something that would destroy everything she believed about trust, loyalty, and human decency. The safe was wide open. $2 million in cash, precious family heirlooms, and rare diamonds lay exposed before her eyes. But this wasn't an accident. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't even a test of her honesty. It was something far more disturbing. A trap rooted in fear and racial bias, targeting the one person he claimed to trust the most. While others were investigated out of paranoia, Catherine's test was personal, shaped by assumptions, not evidence. And what happened next would shock the world, destroy lives, and ultimately change employment law forever. What you're about to hear is the true story of how one woman's integrity exposed the ugly truth about power, privilege, and the price of blind loyalty in modern America. Before we explore this extraordinary story that made international headlines and sparked nationwide protests, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Catherine Williams had never imagined that cleaning houses would become her life's calling. Born in Detroit to a family that valued hard work above all else, she had dreams of becoming a teacher. College seemed within reach until her father's factory closed in 2008, taking their savings and her future with it. At 24, Catherine made a decision that would define the next decade of her life. She moved to Los Angeles with $300 and a fierce determination to build something better for herself and her younger brother Marcus, who was still in high school back home. The domestic worker agencies of Beverly Hills became her hunting ground, and within 2 weeks, she found herself standing in front of the most magnificent mansion she had ever seen. Thomas Richardson was not what Catherine expected from a billionaire. At 57, the tech mogul had built his fortune developing cloud security software that protected the world's largest corporations from cyber threats. His company, CyberShield Technologies, had become the invisible backbone of digital commerce, and Richardson had become one of Silicon Valley's most respected figures. He was quiet, methodical, and surprisingly kind to his staff. Unlike the horror stories Catherine had heard about working for the ultra-wealthy, Richardson treated her with genuine respect from day one. He remembered her birthday, asked about her brother's college applications, and even helped Marcus secure a scholarship to USC. For 9 years, Catherine wasn't just an employee in the Richardson household. She was part of a family. The Richardson mansion sprawled across 4 acres of prime Beverly Hills real estate, featuring 12 bedrooms, 8 bathrooms, a home theater, wine cellar, and library that contained first-edition books worth more than most people's annual salaries. But the crown jewel of Richardson's wealth was his private study, a sanctuary where he conducted his most sensitive business dealings and stored his most precious possessions. The custom-built safe in that study contained more than just money. It held rare coins passed down from his grandfather, his late wife's jewelry collection, bearer bonds worth millions, and computer drives containing prototype software that could revolutionize cybersecurity. Access to this room was restricted to Richardson himself and Catherine, who cleaned it once weekly under his direct supervision. Catherine's reputation in Beverly Hills domestic worker circles was legendary. She had never missed a scheduled day, never broken anything valuable, never gossiped about her employer's private affairs, and never once asked for a raise despite inflation eating away at her purchasing power. Her references were impeccable, her background checks spotless, and her loyalty absolute. Richardson often bragged to his business associates about finding the perfect employee, someone who understood that discretion and trustworthiness were worth more than gold. He had no idea that his faith in Catherine would soon be put to the ultimate test, and the results would destroy everything he thought he knew about human nature. The events that led to that fateful October morning began 6 months earlier, when Richardson's corporate world started crumbling around him. A series of high-profile data breaches had rocked the tech industry, and competitors were aggressively poaching his top engineers with signing bonuses worth millions. 3 of his most trusted executives had defected to rivals, taking proprietary algorithms and client lists with them. The FBI's cybercrime division had briefed Richardson on sophisticated infiltration schemes where competitors hired domestic workers, gardeners, and maintenance staff to plant surveillance devices in executives' homes. Corporate espionage had evolved beyond boardroom stealing into something more personal and invasive. Richardson's paranoia grew with each passing week. He installed additional security cameras throughout the mansion, hired private investigators to conduct background checks on his entire staff, and began questioning Catherine about conversations she might have overheard during his business calls. The man who had once trusted her completely now watched her every move with suspicious eyes. Catherine noticed the change immediately. The warm good mornings became curt nods. The genuine interest in her family became perfunctory inquiries. The man who had been like a father figure was transforming into something else entirely. She attributed it to business stress and tried to maintain the same level of professional excellence that had defined their relationship for nearly a decade. The breaking point came on October 15th, when Richardson discovered that his former head of security had been secretly recording executive meetings for 2 years and selling information to competitors. The betrayal cut deep, because Richardson had trusted this man with his life, his family's safety, and access to his most intimate spaces. If someone so close could betray him so completely, who else might be working against him? The investigation revealed that the security chief had recruited several domestic workers from other wealthy households to plant listening devices and photograph sensitive documents. Richardson's worldview shattered completely. Everyone was a potential threat. Everyone had a price. Everyone could be bought or coerced into betrayal. Catherine had no knowledge of these corporate machinations. She continued her duties with the same dedication that had characterized her work for 9 years, unaware that Richardson was now viewing her through a lens of suspicion and racial prejudice that he had kept carefully hidden for decades. The foundation of trust they had built together was cracking, and neither of them understood how deep those cracks had become. The stage was set for a confrontation that would destroy lives and expose the ugly reality of how quickly respect can turn to suspicion when fear overrides reason. October 22, 2019, began like any other Tuesday in the Richardson household. Catherine arrived at exactly 7 in the morning, as she had for over 3,000 consecutive days. She carried her usual supplies, eco-friendly cleaning products that Richardson preferred, fresh flowers from the farmer's market for the main hallway, and a thermos of coffee that her neighbor had given her from her small cafe. Richardson was already in his home office, participating in a video conference with investors in Tokyo, but he acknowledged Catherine with a brief wave through the glass door. She began her weekly routine, dusting the main living areas, organizing Richardson's extensive book collection, and preparing to clean his private study once his morning meetings concluded. At 8:47 a.m., Richardson made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The video conference had gone poorly, with investors expressing concerns about his company's security protocols following recent industry breaches. His paranoia reached a fever pitch as he imagined Catherine listening to sensitive conversations, photographing important documents, or recording his personal phone calls. The rational part of his mind knew these fears were unfounded, but fear had overpowered reason. He decided to conduct what he told himself was a simple test of Catherine's character, not acknowledging the racial undertones that drove his suspicions. Richardson opened his private safe completely, something he had never done in Catherine's presence. He removed several items and arranged them carelessly on his desk. Stacks of $100 bills totaling approximately $50,000, his late wife's diamond bracelet worth $200,000, and a folder containing banking information for his offshore accounts. He positioned these valuable items in plain sight, activated the hidden security cameras he had recently installed, and left for what he told Catherine would be a brief meeting with his lawyer downtown. In reality, Richardson drove to a Starbucks 3 miles away and monitored the live security feed on his laptop, waiting to see if the woman he had trusted for 9 years would prove his worst fears correct. Catherine entered the study at 9:15 a.m., expecting to find Richardson's usual organized workspace. Instead, she discovered what appeared to be the aftermath of a burglary. The safe gaped open like a wound, valuable items scattered across the mahogany desk, and no sign of Richardson anywhere in the house. Her first instinct was panic. Had someone broken into the mansion during the night? Was Richardson hurt? She immediately reached for her phone to call 911, then hesitated. What if this was some kind of business transaction she didn't understand? What if calling the police would embarrass Richardson or interfere with his affairs? For 47 minutes, Catherine wrestled with the decision. The security cameras captured every moment of her internal struggle, pacing around the room, picking up individual items to examine them for signs of damage, checking and rechecking the windows and doors for signs of forced entry, and repeatedly reaching for her phone before stopping herself. Her face showed genuine concern for Richardson's safety, not greed or opportunism. She carefully returned each item to what she believed was its proper place in the safe, organized the scattered papers on his desk, and even watered the plants in his study that looked slightly dry. The most revealing moment came when Catherine discovered the folder containing Richardson's banking information had fallen open, revealing account numbers and passwords for financial institutions in 3 countries. Instead of photographing the documents or memorizing the information, she immediately closed the folder and placed it securely in the safe. Her actions were those of someone protecting her employer's interests, not someone planning to exploit his carelessness. She even wrote a note on Richardson's letterhead explaining what she had found and secured, then placed it prominently on his desk where he couldn't miss it. Richardson watched all of this unfold on his laptop screen, his emotions cycling between relief and shame. Catherine's behavior was exactly what he should have expected from someone who had proven her trustworthiness thousands of times over nearly a decade. But instead of feeling grateful, Richardson found himself analyzing her actions for signs of deception. Why had she hesitated before calling the police? Why had she spent so much time examining the valuable items? His paranoia had created a lens through which even innocent actions appeared suspicious, and he couldn't see past his own prejudices to recognize Catherine's genuine concern for his welfare. At 10:02 a.m., Catherine made a discovery that changed everything. While securing the last items in Richardson's safe, she found a manila folder labeled Domestic Staff Security Assessment that had been hidden behind the cash bundles. Inside were detailed background investigation reports on her and 3 other household employees, complete with photographs, financial records, immigration status checks, and what the private investigator had labeled cultural loyalty assessments. The report on Catherine included surveillance photos taken outside her apartment, records of her phone calls and text messages, interviews with her neighbors conducted under false pretenses, and a psychological profile that described her as typical of her demographic, initially trustworthy, but potentially corruptible under financial pressure. Catherine's hands shook as she read page after page of invasion into every aspect of her private life. The report detailed her brother's college grades, her mother's medical bills, her church attendance, even her grocery shopping patterns. Richardson had hired professional investigators to spy on her for months, treating her like a criminal suspect rather than a trusted employee. The final page contained the investigators' recommendations. Continued monitoring advised. Subject shows no current signs of disloyalty, but demographic studies suggest increased risk during periods of economic stress. Recommend periodic integrity testing to confirm ongoing trustworthiness. The betrayal cut deeper than Catherine could have imagined. For 9 years, she had believed that Richardson respected and valued her as an individual. She had shared stories about her family, her dreams, her struggles, thinking they had built a relationship based on mutual trust and genuine care. Now she understood that every conversation had been evaluated for signs of deception, every personal detail cataloged as potential leverage against her. Every moment of kindness calculated to maintain her loyalty, while he investigated her life like she was a criminal. Richardson returned to the mansion at 11:30 a.m., his anxiety mixing with anticipation as he prepared to review the security footage. In his mind, Catherine had passed the test by not stealing anything, confirming his belief that his screening processes and management techniques were effective. He expected to feel vindicated, perhaps even generous enough to give Catherine a bonus for her honesty. Instead, he found something that shattered his comfortable assumptions about both Catherine and himself. The security footage told a story Richardson hadn't expected to see. Catherine's genuine concern for his safety, her careful protection of his valuables, her immediate instinct to preserve rather than exploit his carelessness. But more importantly, the cameras had captured her discovery of the investigation folder and her emotional breakdown upon reading its contents. Richardson watched Catherine crying silently as she learned the extent of his surveillance, saw her hands trembling as she read character assessments that reduced her to racial stereotypes and economic predictors. For the first time in months, Richardson saw Catherine as the individual human being she had always been rather than a potential security threat. The woman on his security monitors wasn't plotting against him or calculating opportunities for theft. She was heartbroken, betrayed, and struggling to understand how someone she had trusted could have treated her with such suspicion and disrespect. Richardson realized that his test hadn't revealed Catherine's character. It had exposed his own moral failings and the extent to which fear and prejudice had corrupted his judgment. Catherine was organizing the kitchen when Richardson approached her, his prepared speech about the importance of security suddenly seeming inadequate and insulting. She looked up at him with eyes that held no anger, only a profound sadness that cut deeper than any accusation could have. Richardson found himself unable to speak, the justifications he had rehearsed dissolving under her steady gaze. The silence stretched between them, filled with 9 years of shared history that had been permanently altered by one morning of mutual revelation. "I know about the test," Catherine said quietly, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "I know about the investigators, the surveillance, the reports about my demographic and my cultural loyalty patterns. I know you've been watching me, documenting my life, treating me like a criminal who just hasn't been caught yet." Richardson started to interrupt to explain about corporate espionage and security protocols, but Catherine held up her hand. "I'm not finished, Mr. Richardson. For 9 years, I thought we had built something real. I thought you saw me as a person, not just hired help. I thought when you asked about Marcus's college applications, you cared about his future. I thought when you remembered my birthday, it meant something." The weight of Catherine's words hit Richardson like a physical blow. Every genuine moment they had shared, every personal conversation, every small kindness had been real for her while being filtered through his growing suspicions. He had turned their relationship into a professional transaction, while she had continued to invest her heart in what she believed was a family connection. His test hadn't been about her honesty. It had been about his inability to see past his own fears and prejudices to recognize the loyalty that had been freely given for nearly a decade. "I never stole anything from you," Catherine continued, her voice growing stronger. "I never betrayed your confidence, never gossiped about your private affairs, never took advantage of your trust. But you stole from me, Mr. Richardson. You stole my privacy, my dignity, and my belief that good people still existed in positions of power. Your investigators know more about my personal life than my own family does. They've been photographing me, interviewing my neighbors under false names, analyzing my spending patterns like I'm some kind of corporate espionage threat." Richardson finally found his voice, but the words came out as justifications rather than apologies. "Catherine, you have to understand the business environment I'm operating in, the corporate espionage, the infiltration attempts, the competitors who are using domestic staff to plant surveillance devices. I had to be sure, had to know that everyone in my home was trustworthy." His explanation sounded hollow even to his own ears, a rationalization for behavior that had crossed every ethical boundary he claimed to respect. "You could have asked me," Catherine replied. "You could have explained your concerns, requested additional security measures, or simply told me that you needed to be more careful about sensitive information. Instead, you hired strangers to spy on my family, my friends, my private life. You reduced me to a demographic category in a security report. You turned 9 years of mutual respect into a criminal investigation, and then you tested me like I was a potential thief who just needed the right opportunity. The conversation that followed revealed the depth of Richardson's transformation from trusted employer to paranoid controller. Catherine learned that the hidden cameras in the study were just the beginning. Richardson had been recording conversations throughout the house for months, monitoring her phone calls when possible and even tracking her car's movements through GPS surveillance. The man she had respected had become someone she no longer recognized, someone whose fear had overwhelmed his humanity to such an extent that he could justify any invasion of privacy as necessary business security. Richardson, meanwhile, was confronting the reality of what his paranoia had cost him. Catherine wasn't just his most trusted employee. She was one of the few people in his life who had shown genuine care for his well-being without expecting anything in return. Her loyalty hadn't been purchased with salary and benefits. It had been earned through years of mutual respect and authentic human connection. By treating her as a potential threat rather than a valuable friend, he had destroyed something irreplaceable and revealed himself to be exactly the kind of person he had always claimed to despise, someone who used power to exploit and dehumanize others. The confrontation ended with Catherine placing her house keys on Richardson's kitchen counter and walking away from 9 years of her life. She didn't quit dramatically or make threats about lawsuits or public exposure. She simply said, "I can't work for someone who sees me as a threat to be managed rather than a person to be respected. Find someone else to clean your house, Mr. Richardson. Find someone else to care about your well-being. Find someone else to trust, if that's even possible for you anymore." The silence in the Richardson mansion after Catherine's departure was deafening. For the first time in 9 years, Richardson was truly alone in his 4-acre palace, surrounded by all the security measures and surveillance equipment that had failed to protect him from the one threat he hadn't anticipated: his own moral bankruptcy. The house that had been a warm home became a cold monument to paranoia and prejudice, its empty rooms echoing with the ghost of genuine human connection that had been carelessly destroyed. Richardson's first instinct was to minimize the damage through legal means. He contacted his attorney about requiring Catherine to sign additional non-disclosure agreements, preventing her from discussing the surveillance or the circumstances of her departure. His lawyer, however, painted a grim picture of Richardson's legal exposure. The surveillance activities, particularly the recording of private conversations and tracking of personal movements, violated numerous privacy laws. The private investigation report with its racial profiling and demographic assessments could be considered discriminatory employment practices. Most damaging of all, the integrity test involving deliberately exposed valuables could be interpreted as entrapment or harassment. Meanwhile, Catherine faced her own difficult decisions. Losing her primary source of income after 9 years was financially devastating, but the emotional trauma of discovering the extent of Richardson's surveillance ran much deeper. She had built her identity around being trustworthy, reliable, and valued for her character rather than just her labor. Richardson's actions had shattered that sense of self-worth and left her questioning whether any employer could truly see her as an equal human being rather than a potential threat to be managed. The story might have ended there, two damaged people retreating into their respective corners to nurse their wounds privately. But Richardson's corporate troubles were far from over, and his treatment of Catherine became part of a larger pattern that would soon attract unwanted attention from regulators and advocacy organizations. The FBI's investigation into corporate espionage in the tech industry expanded to include examination of how executives were protecting themselves at home, and Richardson's surveillance activities became part of a federal case study on privacy violations and discriminatory employment practices. Catherine, meanwhile, had connected with the National Domestic Workers Alliance, an organization fighting for the rights and dignity of household employees across the country. Her story resonated with thousands of domestic workers who had experienced similar treatment, being treated as potential threats rather than trusted employees, subjected to excessive surveillance and investigation, and having their loyalty questioned based on racial or economic stereotypes rather than their actual performance and character. The broader implications of Richardson's actions became clear as more details emerged about the private investigation firm he had hired. The company specialized in demographic risk assessment for wealthy clients, providing services that were barely legal and often crossed into discriminatory territory. Their reports routinely included racial and ethnic profiling, economic vulnerability assessments, and predictions about employee behavior based on stereotypes rather than individual character. Richardson hadn't just violated Catherine's privacy. He had participated in a system that dehumanized domestic workers across the entire industry. Legal experts who reviewed Richardson's case identified multiple violations of employment law, privacy rights, and anti-discrimination statutes. The surveillance activities, particularly those conducted without Catherine's knowledge or consent, violated wiretapping laws in California. The private investigation report's demographic profiling could be considered evidence of discriminatory employment practices. Most seriously, the deliberate test of Catherine's honesty while under surveillance might constitute harassment or creating a hostile work environment based on racial assumptions. The psychological impact on Catherine was severe and long-lasting. The woman who had prided herself on earning trust through character and performance now doubted whether any employer could see past racial stereotypes to appreciate her individual worth. The discovery that Richardson had been documenting and analyzing her private life for months left her feeling violated and vulnerable in ways that went far beyond simple employment disagreements. She had lost not just a job, but her faith in the possibility of genuine respect across racial and economic lines. Richardson's reputation in Silicon Valley began to suffer as word of his surveillance activities spread through informal networks. Tech executives who had once admired his security-conscious approach now viewed him as someone whose paranoia had crossed ethical boundaries. His company's stock price declined as investors worried about leadership that applied corporate espionage tactics to personal relationships. The man who had built his fortune on protecting others' security had destroyed his own credibility through actions that revealed character flaws incompatible with trusted leadership. The media attention that followed transformed Catherine's personal trauma into a national conversation about domestic worker rights, racial profiling in employment, and the abuse of surveillance technology by wealthy individuals. Her story became a symbol of how economic inequality and racial prejudice could corrupt even seemingly positive employer-employee relationships. The case study of Richardson's actions was cited in congressional hearings about privacy rights and used by advocacy organizations to push for stronger protections for domestic workers nationwide. 6 months after Catherine walked away from the Richardson mansion, the consequences of that October morning had multiplied beyond anything either party could have anticipated. The National Domestic Workers Alliance had filed formal complaints with multiple federal agencies, citing Richardson's case as evidence of systematic discrimination and privacy violations affecting household employees across the country. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission opened an investigation into Richardson's hiring and monitoring practices. The Federal Trade Commission began examining the private investigation firm he had used, uncovering a network of companies that specialized in demographic profiling and surveillance services for wealthy clients. Catherine's decision to go public with her story had transformed her from victim to advocate. She testified before Congress about the need for stronger privacy protections for domestic workers, sharing details about the extent of surveillance she had unknowingly endured. Her testimony was particularly powerful because she spoke not with anger or resentment, but with the dignity and professionalism that had characterized her work for 9 years. She made it clear that her goal wasn't revenge against Richardson personally, but systemic change to prevent other domestic workers from experiencing similar violations of their privacy and dignity. Richardson, meanwhile, faced escalating legal and financial consequences. The FBI's cybersecurity investigation had revealed that his surveillance activities violated multiple federal laws, including wiretapping statutes and privacy regulations. His company's government contracts were under review, with federal agencies questioning whether someone who violated privacy rights in his personal life could be trusted to protect sensitive government information. CyberShield Technologies' stock price had fallen by 40%, wiping out more than $1 billion in shareholder value and threatening Richardson's position as CEO. The civil lawsuit that Catherine eventually filed against Richardson became a landmark case in domestic worker rights. Her legal team argued that the surveillance, investigation, and integrity testing constituted a pattern of harassment and discrimination based on racial stereotypes. The private investigation report became crucial evidence, with its explicit demographic profiling and cultural assumptions demonstrating that Richardson's suspicions were based on prejudice rather than any actual evidence of wrongdoing. The case attracted support from major civil rights organizations and labor unions, who saw it as an opportunity to establish important precedents for domestic worker protection. Richardson's deposition in the civil case revealed the full extent of his moral collapse. Under oath, he was forced to admit that he had never had any reason to suspect Catherine of wrongdoing, that his decision to conduct surveillance was based on fears rather than evidence, and that the integrity test was motivated by assumptions about her character based on race and economic status, rather than her actual 9-year performance record. His attempts to justify the surveillance as reasonable business security fell apart when lawyers pointed out that he hadn't subjected his white employees to similar investigation and monitoring. The private investigation firm that Richardson had hired became the subject of a federal investigation when Catherine's case revealed the extent of their discriminatory practices. The company had built their business model around providing wealthy clients with detailed profiles of domestic workers that included racial and ethnic stereotyping, economic vulnerability assessments, and predictions about behavior based on demographic categories rather than individual character. Their client list included dozens of wealthy households across California, all of whom had potentially violated their employees' privacy rights through similar surveillance and profiling activities. Catherine's case also exposed the psychological damage caused by treating domestic workers as potential security threats rather than trusted employees. Expert testimony from psychologists and social workers detailed how surveillance and investigation activities created traumatic stress for workers who believed they were part of their employers' families. The betrayal of trust wasn't just a personal issue between Catherine and Richardson. It represented a broader pattern of how economic and racial inequality could corrupt relationships that appeared positive on the surface, but were actually based on power imbalances and suspicious monitoring. The financial settlement that Richardson ultimately agreed to pay Catherine was substantial, reportedly in the millions of dollars, but the real victory was the precedent established by the case. Federal regulators used Richardson's actions as the foundation for new guidelines protecting domestic workers from excessive surveillance and discriminatory investigation practices. State legislatures across the country introduced bills requiring disclosure of any monitoring or investigation activities involving household employees. The case became required reading in law schools and business ethics courses as an example of how paranoia and prejudice could destroy lives and careers. Richardson's personal reckoning was perhaps the most profound consequence of his actions. The man who had prided himself on rational decision-making and ethical business practices was forced to confront the reality that he had become exactly the kind of person he had always claimed to despise. His treatment of Catherine revealed character flaws that went far deeper than business paranoia. It exposed a fundamental inability to see people different from himself as equally deserving of respect and dignity. The security measures he had implemented to protect himself from external threats had failed to protect him from his own moral weakness. The broader tech industry used Richardson's downfall as a cautionary tale about the dangers of applying corporate security thinking to personal relationships. Industry leaders who had once admired his comprehensive approach to protection now understood that some tactics were incompatible with basic human decency. Richardson's case became a catalyst for broader discussions about surveillance technology, privacy rights, and the responsibilities that came with economic power and technological capability. Catherine's advocacy work continued long after her legal victory, as she worked with organizations across the country to strengthen protections for domestic workers and educate employers about the importance of treating household employees with dignity and respect. Her story became a powerful tool for changing attitudes and policies, demonstrating that the fight for worker rights wasn't just about wages and benefits, but about fundamental human dignity and the right to privacy in employment relationships. 2 years after that October morning that changed everything, the full scope of Richardson's surveillance network finally came to light during ongoing federal investigations. What Catherine had experienced wasn't an isolated incident of paranoid behavior, but part of a systematic program that Richardson had implemented throughout his business and personal life. The private investigation firm he had hired had been monitoring not just his domestic staff, but his corporate employees, business partners, and even members of his own family. Richardson's paranoia had consumed every relationship in his life, turning genuine human connections into data points in elaborate security assessments. The psychological evaluation that Richardson underwent as part of his legal proceedings revealed a man who had become so isolated by wealth and power that he had lost the ability to trust anyone without extensive verification and monitoring. His fear of betrayal had become a self-fulfilling prophecy, creating the very disloyalty he had sought to prevent by treating everyone in his life as potential threats rather than human beings deserving of basic respect. The irony was profound. In trying to protect himself from betrayal, Richardson had betrayed everyone who had genuinely cared about him. Catherine's impact on domestic worker rights extended far beyond her individual case. Her testimony before Congress had helped pass the Domestic Worker Privacy Protection Act, federal legislation that prohibited employers from conducting surveillance or investigation activities without explicit consent and clear justification. Her advocacy work had inspired similar legislation in 12 states, creating a framework of protections that covered nearly half of all domestic workers in the United States. The woman who had simply wanted to clean houses and support her family had become a national voice for worker dignity and privacy rights. Richardson's corporate empire never recovered from the scandal. CyberShield Technologies lost most of its government contracts when federal agencies decided that a CEO who violated privacy rights couldn't be trusted to protect sensitive information. The company's stock continued declining as customers and partners distanced themselves from Richardson's toxic reputation. Eventually, the board of directors forced Richardson to resign, though by then the damage to the company's reputation and market value was irreversible. The business he had spent decades building was destroyed by his inability to trust the people closest to him. The private investigation firm that had enabled Richardson's surveillance activities faced criminal charges for discriminatory business practices and privacy violations. Their business model of providing demographic profiling and cultural assessment services was found to violate multiple federal laws protecting workers from discrimination and harassment. The firm's client list became evidence in dozens of similar cases across the country, exposing a network of wealthy individuals who had been systematically violating their employees' privacy rights through surveillance and investigation activities. Catherine's personal healing took years of therapy and support from advocacy organizations, but she eventually found peace with her experience. She understood that Richardson's actions reflected his own moral failings rather than any inadequacy on her part. Her 9 years of faithful service had been real, even if Richardson's appreciation had been corrupted by fear and prejudice. She had maintained her integrity throughout the ordeal, protecting Richardson's interests even while discovering the extent of his betrayal, and that knowledge helped her rebuild her sense of self-worth and professional pride. The broader conversations sparked by Catherine's case led to fundamental changes in how domestic work was perceived and regulated across the United States. Household employees were no longer seen as expendable labor to be monitored and controlled, but as skilled professionals deserving of the same workplace protections and dignity afforded to any other workers. The case established important legal precedents about privacy rights, discriminatory surveillance, and the obligations of employers to treat all workers with respect regardless of race or economic status. Richardson's ultimate fate was perhaps the most fitting consequence of his actions. The man who had possessed everything wealth could buy found himself isolated and financially ruined, his reputation destroyed by his own moral choices. He lost not just his business empire and personal fortune, but the respect of his peers, the trust of his remaining family members, and any chance of rebuilding the authentic human connections that might have given his life meaning. The security measures he had implemented to protect himself from betrayal had failed to protect him from the consequences of his own betrayal of others. In the end, the test that Richardson had designed to evaluate Catherine's character had revealed the content of his own soul instead. The woman who had dedicated 9 years to caring for him with genuine loyalty had proven her worth through her response to betrayal, maintaining her dignity and integrity even while fighting for justice. Richardson, meanwhile, had failed every test that mattered. The test of basic human decency, the test of moral leadership, and the test of whether wealth and power would make him a better person or reveal the worst aspects of his character. The mansion in Beverly Hills eventually sold at a significant loss, its reputation tainted by the surveillance scandal and legal proceedings. The new owners removed all the security cameras and monitoring equipment, choosing to trust their staff rather than spy on them. Catherine Williams continued her advocacy work, using her experience to protect other domestic workers from the kind of surveillance and discrimination she had endured. And somewhere in a modest apartment, a disgraced billionaire learned too late that the only security that truly mattered was the security that came from treating others with the dignity and respect that every human being deserved. The legacy of that October morning when a safe was deliberately left open would endure in legislation, legal precedents, and changed attitudes about worker rights and human dignity. It would serve as a permanent reminder that true character isn't revealed by tests of honesty under surveillance, but by how we treat those who depend on us for their livelihoods, and how we respond when given the power to help or harm others. Catherine Williams had passed every test that mattered, while Thomas Richardson had failed the only examination that would ultimately define his life and legacy. What do you think about Richardson's decision? Was it really about protecting his empire, or about exposing his own fears and assumptions? And Catherine, did she go too far, or was her quiet resistance the most powerful response of all? Let us know in the comments. We read everyone. And if you found this story powerful or eye-opening, don't forget to hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel for more true stories that challenge the lines between trust, loyalty, and justice.